The tax deadline is just 9 days away, and our User's Guide to Taxes is here to help make the whole filing process easier. Just last week, IRS Chief John Koskinen gave troubling news that the agency is so overwhelmed that it's unable to answer 60% of taxpayers' calls. So is this acceptable? Joining me now, Americans for Tax Reform President Grover Norquist.
It's not acceptable, and this year it's particularly not acceptable. This is the first year ObamaCare really kicks in. The 20 taxes in ObamaCare, the rebates and the penalties if you don't buy ACA-approved, ObamaCare-approved insurance. People got subsidies. Half of the people who got subsidies paid too much, and the IRS is going to want the $500 or so back. So all the mess that is ObamaCare is now merged with the mess that is the IRS. And why this year? Well, when they passed this in 2010, they didn't have it happen before 2012 when President Obama had to get reelected. They even in Congress thought about themselves, not the taxpayers, but themselves a little bit, and put it after 2014 because off-year elections in the second term of an administration are very ugly for incumbents. So we're getting it now.
It's a good way to hide the problem. I want to show folks, here's what we're talking about. Here are the forms and like the little background explainers for people who have to file. And I want to read some of the material from this, because let me tell you, Grover, I know you're very experienced at this. I don't even think you're going to understand it. Here's what one of these ObamaCare tax forms says. You tell me if you can get it. It says, if you and your former spouse must allocate policy amounts, you will allocate to each spouse a percentage of the total enrollment premiums for the applicable SLCSP and APTC, respectively. You and your former spouse can allocate these amounts in any proportion you agree upon, but you must allocate all amounts in the same proportion. What?
Remember when they set up ObamaCare and that didn't work very well? And now they've merged that with the IRS and both don't work very well. And the president walks away as if somebody else created this mess. They ought to be spending some time cleaning this up before we have to live with it.
Now, I got to tell you, we were talking earlier about these long hold times for folks. Let's take a look at those numbers. In 2005, the average hold times were 4 minutes. The projected number for this year, 30 minutes. And John Koskinen, who runs this agency, says, it's all about the budget. Do you agree with that, Grover?
Well, first of all, they've been making decisions on how they're going to allocate resources. We saw they spent several years spending all their time making sure that people couldn't start 501c4 and Tea Party groups. Okay, if you've got time to harass people who belong to the Tea Party, you can answer the GD phone from time to time.
Yeah, and it's particularly onerous this year as we have some of these new rules for Obamacare. But let's step back for just a second. I was talking about how complicated these specific rules are, but the reality is the entire tax code is incredibly complicated. I've got a copy of the Bible here. Okay, Grover? The total tax code is ×5. You know, this is how you live your life, maybe, right? If you're a Christian, this is your book. Well, imagine if this was 5 times bigger. That's how big the U.S. tax code is. That's what we have to live by. And let me tell you, you can't understand that unless you're an accountant. Shouldn't it be simpler?
It should be simpler, but the reason they make it complicated is for just that purpose. If it was clear how much you were paying, you could be mad. A lot of people with all those deductions think they're getting away with something, but they don't notice how much they're paying. If it was simpler and more transparent, people would see what they were paying. They'd have a good idea what other people are paying. They think other people aren't paying any taxes. In point of fact, everybody's paying more than they should be paying. The government's too large, taxes are too high, and the government's too messy in the way that it collects it.
Well, I know a lot of people out there are saying amen and amen to you. I want to bring up another issue, though, that I think is critically important. Nina Olson, who is a taxpayer advocate, talks about this all the time. She says, stop thinking about enforcement and just help the people out there who want to pay the taxes, because they are the vast majority. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and that's what the government ought to be doing, and they ought to make it easy to pay your taxes. They make it difficult, and then they yell at people. Of course, if the IRS gives you advice or tells you that something's okay, that's no defense if they decide later that it's wrong. They've also been making up new rules. They started sending letters to conservative contributors, donors, to say maybe their contribution to the Heritage Foundation is a gift and should be hit with a gift tax. They didn't send that to left-of-center donors or groups. They did it to harass conservative donors, and they're just making this stuff up.
Well,
so
I mean,
they
there
don't
are
have the
lots
time to
of
answer the
questions
phone
right now about how the IRS is enforcing the rules. And Nina, like a lot of people out there say, stop focusing on enforcement. Let me show you some numbers here to give you an idea why that is so wrong-headed. If the government really wants to collect money, they would help people. Listen to this. If the IRS were to collect 10% less in enforcement revenue, tax revenues in total would combine by $6 billion. However, if voluntary tax payments were to drop by the same amount, 10%, tax revenues would go down by $300 billion. So you get the idea here, right? It's the big kahuna here isn't the people, the scofflaws out there. It's the people who are filing their taxes, doing what they're supposed to do, asking questions, wanting help. They've got to get it. This is complicated stuff. And ultimately, I think what has to happen is we have to make it simpler. I know you want to get rid of the IRS altogether, but for goodness sakes, at least pick up the phone.
That would be a good first start. And look, recognize that you work for the taxpayers, not the other way around. That's not the attitude that the IRS agents take, unfortunately.
You are so right about that. Grover, thanks for coming on. Thanks for kicking off our series this week. Really appreciate your time.
Cheerful week. Cheerful week.
That was Grover Norquist. Well, if you